Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for part 2 of the fiscal year 2021 CSBG annual reporting webinar series. My name is Monique Alcantara, and I am a management and program analyst here within the Office of Community Services, Division of Community Assistance. As part of my role here in OCS, I help manage the performance management system, which includes the CSBG annual report. I am joined today by Renika Carr and Lindsay Chatfield, program specialist, Norris Phillip, one of our financial specialists, and Joey Lim, a data analyst. They all serve integral roles in the performance management system. Before we get started, I want to provide a few housekeeping rules. We have muted everyone upon entry and ask that everyone remains muted throughout the webinar. Please feel free to ask questions throughout the presentation and the Q&A pod. We'll try to answer all questions at the end of the presentation. For any questions we are unable to answer, we'll provide additional guidance in future webinars. The chat function is also available, but we will primarily focus on answering questions submitted through the Q&A pod. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted to our OCS CSBG webinars page. Today's webinar will focus on Module 1 of the CSBG annual reports. We'll review the reporting requirements and why we report, the Module 1 reporting strategy, and a high-level overview of Module 1. Then we'll discuss some things to consider as you begin completing Module 1 with a little deeper dive into sections B, E, F, and H. We'll then provide your OCS contacts, have some time for Q&A, and then share the upcoming webinars. So let's review the reporting requirements and why we report. This may look familiar to you as we also shared it last week, but repetition is key. States are expected to submit the annual report, CARES, and disaster supplemental reports together. As Sharice noted last week, OCS wants to ensure that how we collect information across these reports is as streamlined and coordinated as possible. We understand that there are unique challenges of administering these funds, which have been particularly pronounced during the pandemic, and for some states and eligible entities, the additional challenge of responding during disasters. States should already be familiar with the integrated strategies OCS is using to collect information for the annual report and both supplemental grants awarded as noted in the CSBG Dear Colleague 2021-04. One thing that OCS really wants to focus on this year is that we should be thinking of these reports as one report. Though you are reporting in separate forms, the CARES and disaster supplemental annual reports are extensions of your regular CSBG annual report. So in completing this module, really think about what you had to do differently to administer CARES and disaster. The CSBG network will be able to use these as lessons learned and best practices should we receive supplemental funds in the future. And as a reminder, all of the reports are due on March 31st, 2022. OCS will be here to provide you guys support as you guys submit these reports this year. Just to reemphasize why we report, this is truly a shared responsibility across the network at the federal, state, local, and national levels. Lindsay will discuss later how important it is to work with your internal and external colleagues when completing Module 1. While in the CSBG state plan, you report your plan for next year, Module 1 gives you the opportunity to show how effective you were in implementing those plans. OCS uses this information to then show stakeholders and agency efficiency, effectiveness, and overall financial condition, as well as to inform future training and technical assistance. There has been increased conversations about outcomes management, performance management, and evidence-based practices. These are becoming the gold standard in the public sector, and we want to make sure that we're staying up to date with these standards as well, to show just how much CSBG matters to the fight against poverty. Now let's discuss the Module 1 reporting strategy. This should also look familiar as we shared it last week, and it is originally shared in the Dear Colleague 2021-04. Again, this table provides a high-level overview of how states are expected to report for Module 1 of the CSBG, CARES, and disaster supplemental annual reports. As you may recall, Module 1 provides key information on how funds are distributed across eligible entities and the state assessment of compliance with organizational standards. So let's delve a little deeper into Module 1 and how the three compare. All three reports are completed by the CSBG state administrators. For all three reports, you must report based on the federal fiscal year, October 1st, 2020 through September 30th, 2021. The sections highlighted in these darker blue fonts are included in all three reports, while the lighter blue fonts are only included in CSBG and CARES. The sections that are highlighted in black font are only included in the regular CSBG report. Last but certainly not least, for CSBG, you must report on all grants. For the CARES, only report on CARES. And for disaster, only report on disaster. And lastly, I just want to remind you how the pre-populations work for Module 1. Your CSBG annual report will pull from your fiscal year 2020 CSBG State Plan Year 2 or your fiscal year 2021 CSBG State Plan Year 1. For those who chose to use a pro forma for fiscal year 2020 as part of the flexibilities allowed under CARES, it will pull from that information. So for some of you, you might have to do a little bit more updating or tweaking in your annual report, given how long ago you submitted your CSBG state plan. The CSBG CARES annual report does pull from your originally submitted CSBG CARES state plan. So again, we're looking to see how you updated or implemented those plans into your CARES annual report. And finally, the fiscal year 2021 CSBG Disaster Supplemental Annual Report pulls from your prior year Disaster Supplemental Annual Report. This is due to the fact that your disaster supplemental state plans were not submitted through OLDC, so we are pulling your information from your previously submitted annual report. And with that, I'll hand it off to my colleague, Lindsay Chatfield.
Hello, and thank you again for joining us. I'm going to talk about some of the more specific things in Module 1 that you need to consider as you fill out your report. Next slide, please. When you're looking at the entire report, one of the first things you need to make sure you do is consult with various departments. So if you work with your fiscal team on a regular basis, you need to make sure that you include them in your report. If there are other departments within your state structure that you work with regularly, making sure that you include them or request input from them on some of the achievements that you've had and some of the inner workings of your CSBG implementation. It's helpful and it enhances your report and gives you a more full-bodied report out. You should also consider feedback from outside sources. Obviously, we have the ASCI, and your plan specifically talks about the ASCI. There also might be other things from feedback from OCS from prior reports. And obviously, your eligible entities have a heavy influence in what you are going to be reporting, and including them in the process is a great idea to make sure you're including everything and from your CSBG implementation in your report. Consider performance advancement. one of the things that we find is that sometimes there are incongruencies between one year to the next. So you might report $500,000 for one section in your report, and the next year that number is lower or higher. And you want to make sure that you double check some of those things to make sure that you're being consistent and to catch some red flags that might otherwise pop up. You also want to be able to look at some of the things that you reported out the previous year to see if you have improved upon those or if those have been furthered in your progress. We look at those fluctuations from year to year, and so we recommend that you read your previous year report before you sit down to do your fiscal year 21. Do a final check before you submit your report. Make sure that everything is addressed in each section. Sometimes one part of a section is addressed and another part is not. So it's helpful to do one last review before you hit that submit button. We see a lot of, sometimes we see a lot of dates that are incorrect. So we'll see 2019 instead of 2020. This year we would be looking for 2020 when you mean 2021. And before you do anything, you should make sure that your plan is up to date. So if you have a de-designation, or if you've somehow had a switch in eligible entity, or you've switched some of your CARES Act budgeting, you want to make sure that your plan reflects that so you can be reporting out on the proper thing. Next slide. When you're looking at section B for your statewide goals and accomplishments, you're going to do CARES and CSBG. The applicable sections, and I'm might not be saying these right, but SAMs, one SAI, one SEI, and one SBII or two. Those are the applicable statutes and regulations. We're looking for any progress on CSBG state-specific goals that are described that have been implemented. It is not required for the state to have made progress towards your goals. And so this is actually a really important thing. We're not looking necessarily for all of your goals to be done. We are looking for any progress. We understand that things change, especially the last 2 years of life in America. Everything has been thrown a curveball. So it's not necessarily that you achieve all of the goals that you laid out in your plan, as long as you make sure that you explain them. And that's what we're looking for. We're looking for you to explain what happened and give us reasons why, what lessons you learned in your process. So we are more than happy to accept, and we look for partially accepted goals or not accepted goals because we want those lessons learned to continuously improve your CSBG. We are looking for this information because we always want to understand the goals and priorities and what our agencies and our states are doing in the field, because we want to improve performance and provide the best possible end result to our states and our populations as we can. Next slide. I'm going to turn it over now to Renika.
It would be me.
I'm sorry.
Section E. No, that's fine. Thank you all for joining again. The information I'm going to cover is Section E, use of funds. The reporting period for the FY 2021 annual report for CSBG regular, CARES, and disaster is October 1st, 2020 through September 30th, 2021. There are 3 separate reports to be submitted, and I want to clarify what information is to be completed in Section E of each report. When reporting in Section E of the regular CSBG annual report, we want you to include the 90% pass-through, the state administrative funds, and discretionary amount for CARES and disaster if received. For the CARES annual report, the information in Section E is to include CARES-only funds. In disaster supplemental report, the information is to include disaster-only funds. Next slide. I want to go over the parts of Section E and break down a little bit more in detail about what we're looking for. So in actual allocations, this is the amount of funds actually allocated of the 90% in the year being reported on. When completing the CSBG regular report, this should include CARES and disaster 90% allocation as well. In E2 obligations, this is the total obligations of current year funds, which is the FY21 award. These obligations should not include carryover from any prior year. We're looking for how much was spent of the allocation awarded to the subrecipients. This may be higher than the actual allocation of funds, but the state provides this may be higher than the actual allocation of funds if the state provides additional funding for the eligible entity. In the state administrative funds, OCS prefers that you follow the state's definition of obligations and again, stick to the current year funds that was obligated during the FY21 federal fiscal year. So that's 10/1/2020 to 9/30/2021. And again, when completing the CSBG regular report, this will include state administrative funds allocated for CSBG regular, CARES, and disaster if you received it. In general, we don't have a specific requirement of what constitutes an obligation, so each state has the authority to use their own rules and laws. If the state does not have a definition of what is an obligation, I would go with, has a commitment been made on behalf of the state that the other party has a reasonable expectation that the state would pay an expenditure? But most states have a definition of what constitutes an obligation. In E7, use of remainder discretionary funds, please do not include any amounts reported in E2 or E4. For some states, we are aware that the state legislator has some allocate 95% of their CSBG funds to subrecipients, which means you would enter 0 if you had no discretionary funds. In the CSBG regular annual report, E7, you will include actual obligation of discretionary funds for CSBG regular, CARES, and disaster if received. Next page. E9A, prior year carryover. This amount should equal to the obligated and not yet paid to the subrecipient at the end of the previous fiscal year. This is just the amount forwarded from the FY20 CSBG award, second half of that grant period. In E9B, carryover for this fiscal year, this should equal the authorized amount less the amount paid to subrecipients and drawn for state expenditure. This amount should reconcile to the balance reported in the payment management system and to the SF 425, which are due in December. What we're looking for is how much is remaining to be obligated in the second half of the FY 2021 CSBG awards. If it looks like the calculations are not correct within the smart forms, please send us an email before you submit to address that issue. And this concludes the overview of section E, and I'd like to pass it on to Ronika. Thank you.
You're muted, Renika.
Thank you, Monique. During this section of this presentation, I will discuss the reporting requirements for section F on training and technical assistance for all 3 annual reports. In section F, OCS emphasizes the importance of training and technical assistance provided to CSBG eligible entities. Whether provided directly by the state office or indirectly by a contractor, training and technical assistance is a critical function of the state CSBG office. Ongoing training and technical assistance provides targeted support to eligible entities with a development need or problem. It strengthens and builds the capacity of their organizations and improves their service delivery systems to support individuals, families, and communities with low incomes to become self-sufficient and move out of poverty. Training and technical assistance should be made available to all CSBG eligible entities in each state and can be tailored as appropriate to specific topics. For the annual report, the state should provide information regarding training and technical assistance activities conducted using the regular CSBG, CARES, and disaster supplemental funds. For the regular CSBG annual report, the state should describe training and technical assistance activities funded by all funding streams, which means the use of administrative or discretionary dollars for regular, CARES, and disaster supplemental activities. While this table will be auto-populated using information from the CSBG state plan, the state will be able to add rows for additional training and technical assistance activities not included in the state plan. For the CARE Supplemental Annual Report, the state should describe training and technical assistance activities funded only with the CSBG CARES Supplemental Administrative and Discretionary Funds. This table will also be auto-populated using information from the CARE state plan, and the state will be able to add rows for additional training and technical assistance activities not included in the state plan. For the disaster supplemental annual report, the state should describe training and technical assistance activities funded only with CSBG disaster supplemental administrative and discretionary funds. For disaster, however, the information is not pre-populated and states must enter information directly because there is no corresponding application or plan built into OLDC. As a reminder, these activities must take place within the reporting period of October 1st, 2020 through September 30th, 2021. I will now pass the mic back over to Norris, who will be discussing the reporting requirements for monitoring, corrective action, and fiscal controls. Norris?
Thank you, Ronika. In the monitoring schedule in H1, what we're looking for is a brief description of your monitoring process. It's just a matter of sharing what happened and why. So if you were scheduled to perform an additional monitoring that has not been scheduled, just give us an idea of why and what happened. Was it a follow-up visit? Was there a particular reason? Did the agency have some issues with other federal awards? Did it have significant turnover? It could be a matter of an agency that was scheduled but not ready for a monitoring visit by the state. What we're looking for in H1 is an understanding of the engagement with your subrecipients to better understand the risk and challenges being faced. In H2 through H5, it is reporting on the corrective action and the QIPs within your state, which is self-explanatory, but I do want to highlight H6 single audit review a little bit more in detail. So in this single audit review, we're looking at the Federal Audit Clearinghouse to reconcile what is reported when we are reviewing the CSBG annual report. What we're looking for as part of our review is that everyone that is supposed to have an audit had one completed, that those things are being reported and include all those findings. And when we're talking about the management decision within the single audit review, we're referring to CSBG findings at the entities. We don't get that many of them, so it's a little bit easier for us to keep track of. And this concludes the overview of section H, and I'd like to pass it on to Joey.
Great, thank you so much, Norris. So these next 3 slides contain the contact information of folks on the OCS team that you can reach out to with any and all questions that you have about your annual report. Next slide, please. First, we have our team of program specialists, and these are their names, their emails, and their phone numbers. These people can offer up their insight and expertise around things like coordination, planning, or technical assistance for your program activities. Each have been assigned to particular regions. So just going from left to right and up and down, we have Lindsay for regions 3 and 8, Jamia for regions 2, 4, and American Samoa, Andrew for region 3 and Puerto Rico, Catherine for regions 5, 7, and 9, and Judith for regions 6 and 10. Next slide, please. In addition to our program specialists, OCS has 2 financial specialists, Norris Phillip III and Angela Kelly. This team provides oversight and monitoring for CSBG, and oversight activities include things like assessment of spending rates, providing training and technical assistance, participation in quarterly calls, as well as conducting monitoring reviews. So for any questions related to those processes, you can reach out to them. Next slide, please. And finally, if you have technical assistance questions related to OLDC, including things like needing to create accounts or access issues, then you can send them over to both Monique Alcantara and Nikki Fraser-Curry. Their contact information is here on this screen. So in reaching out over email to any of the team members that I mentioned, we ask that you also please copy csbgstates@acf.hhs.gov in your correspondence. Next slide, please. So that wraps up the presentation portion of this webinar, and we will now be moving on to the Q&A. I'm going to be reading what questions you received in the Q&A box for our presenters. But just as a reminder, if you do have any questions, please use the Q&A pod rather than the chat box. It just makes it easier for us to monitor the questions that come in. All right, so I am going to start with this one question. This is for Monique. Small states have out-of-date CSBG care plans because they have had partial allocations. What do small states need to do?
So as we mentioned last year, it is really up to the state on whether or not they want to update their care state plan. But you are able to just make those updates in your annual report. I can be a little bit type A, so I would go and update my state plan prior to initializing the annual report. So that way that the annual report has the most recent up-to-date information. But that is really up to you. There's no requirement to update your state plan. But it is more important that the annual report is up to date and accurate.
Great, thank you, Monique. We have a couple of questions here for Norris. Here's the first one. For section E4, is it correct that states should only enter the current year funds obligated for federal fiscal year 2021 and not the carryover federal fiscal year 2020 obligated during 2021?
Yes, we are looking for just the FY 2021 for state administrative funds. If you put in carryover in the FY 2021 annual report, it's hard for us to go and track and separate the 2020 from the 2021 report. So in E4, we're looking for just the FY 2021 state administrative funds.
Perfect, thank you, Norris. And here's a second question for you. For H6, are states only supposed to issue management decision letters when the audit findings are specific to CSBG funding?
Now, OCS is looking for management decision letters when they're specific to the CSBG findings. You may have other requirements for your other programs, but we're looking for management decision letters for audit findings for CSBG specifically.
Great, thank you, Norris. I have a question here for Monique. Is OLDC ready for states to enter their annual reports? In other words,
Yes.
regular CSBG, CARES, and supplemental disaster.
Yes, OLDC is alive and ready to go. We just do remind you, as Nora stated earlier, if there's any pre-population issues or any calculation issues, please reach out to us immediately, especially for Module 1, because we can fix that while you guys are still working on it. Especially for pre-populations, if you notice that any pre-populations are not coming through, I always suggest to check Section C and or Section H to make sure that those pre-populations are showing in C.1 and H.1. If those do not show, please contact me or Nikki immediately. We'll look at it at the background. Do not continue filling it out because you would have to start over at that point. So they are open and ready to go. We'll release a DCL shortly. They were open yesterday, but we just didn't get a chance to release that message.
Great, thank you, Monique. Norris, I have a clarification question that came in for you. For H6, if there are management decisions but not specific to H6, should states mark no?
That is correct.
Thank you. All right. I think those are all of the questions that came in. I'm just going to double check the chat to make sure I didn't miss anything. There is one. So this has to do, if a state has a 2-year plan and there are goals that have been achieved in different sort of in the first year versus the second year, do they need to address goals that had already been reached in year 1 of a 2-year plan?
I can start with the answering, and if Lindsay, you want to add anything to it, please feel free. Yeah, so you should only report on that third goal that was accomplished. There's not a need to reiterate what you already accomplished in year 1. But we do challenge you to think that if all your goals were accomplished in the first year, that maybe you should make some updates to your state plan to consider goals that are going to be accomplished in the second year. For this particular question, you're saying that you did accomplish goals the first year and you have one goal that you accomplished during the second year. So please definitely just provide the update on the goals that you accomplished. We still have access to your prior year report. So only provide updates to that, what you accomplished in the previous year, if there's anything that you want to add to it, like lessons learned, but we are just looking for what you accomplished during fiscal year 2021.
Great. Thank you for the clarification, Monique.
Lindsay, did you want to add anything to that?
Yes, I just wanted to tell people the process to update your plan. If you need to make an adjustment to your state plan, you should contact your program specialist and they can unlock it for you in OLDC, so you can go back in and make those changes. I also just want to reiterate what Monique is saying. If you have a 2-year plan and you accomplished all of your goals in the first year of that 2-year plan, we should adjust your plan to include additional goals. Because the point of a 2-year plan is to encompass all 24 months. So just wanted to reiterate that in this scenario, if you had 3 goals and all 3 were accomplished and you wrote all about them and you reported them all in 2020, we should go take a look at your plan and see what is missing that you will be working on in the second year.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Lindsay. We have one more question here. Monique, I think this is for you. Are XML uploads still the preferred method?
Just to clarify, so for module 1, it's a direct data entry, so no XML uploads are required or needed for module 1. For modules 2 and 4, which we'll talk about a little bit more tomorrow, there isn't necessarily preferred. You do have to upload with XMLs. It's not necessarily a preferred method. It's the only way to update modules 2 and 4. So either you have a state system that creates the XMLs for you, or you use the smart forms that convert into an XML. But for modules 2 and 4, XML is the only method to report modules 2 and 4. And all we see is direct data entry, so no XMLs are needed. Module 3 are attachments, which we'll talk about more tomorrow as well.
Great, thank you, Monique. It looks as though we've addressed all the questions that have come in, and there are no new ones that have popped up for me. So I think with that, we can wrap up the Q&A portion and move into the next slide. Okay, so before we end this webinar, we wanted to remind you of the remaining sessions we have scheduled in our fiscal year 2021 CSBG annual reporting series. This is a table that lists the upcoming webinars with their topic, date, and time. I'm not going to read through all of them, but just want to highlight a few things. First is that our next webinar is scheduled for tomorrow, Wednesday, February 2. In this session, we're going to be providing an overview of submission for modules 2 through 4, as well as addressing what questions you have. Please note that there was a date change. Originally in the action transmittal, this was slated for February 3. Of note, this webinar is also open to CSBG eligible entities. The second thing is that the schedule is available to you online in the fiscal year 2022 CSBG webinars webpage, and we can drop the link in the chat for you to be able to reference. Importantly, we ask that you please remember to pre-register for these sessions, and the pre-registration link can be found on that webpage. And last, there will be webinar announcements coming your way from us, so please be on the lookout. We look forward to your participation in these upcoming sessions. And with that, I will hand it over to Monique to wrap this up.
Thank you, Joey. And thank you everyone for joining today's webinar. If you guys have more questions as you guys are starting to complete your annual report, please do not hesitate to reach out to us. We are here to answer. And if you guys are looking at the webinar schedule and there's something you want to make sure is answered during that webinar, feel free to send your program specialist an email. You can send me an email, and we'll make sure to try to add that to the presentation. We want to make sure that these are educational for everyone. So thank you guys so much, and we look forward to seeing you guys tomorrow.